September of 1876, and Jacob Peterson stood in what passed for the main street of Deer Lodge, Montana Territory, watching three men carry his belongings out of the boarding house. The landlord, a thick-shouldered Irishman named Callahan, had given him until noon. It was 11:47 by the church bell. Jacob had $932 in his pocket. No job since the copper mine closed, and the temperature had dropped to 30 for no wars overnight. Winter in these mountains didn't ask permission. It took what it wanted. And what it wanted was your life if you weren't ready. He was 42 years old, Swedishburn, and he'd survived to Great Lakes winters working lumber camps before the westward pole got him. That counted for something. What didn't count was the 4 walls and roof he'd need before the first real snow, which according to every weathered face in town, would arrive in 6 to 8 weeks, maybe less. "You'll be dead by Christmas," Callahan said, not unkindly as he set Jacob's tool chest on the boardwalk. No man builds proper shelter in 6 weeks, not alone, not with winter coming. Jacob didn't argue. He'd learned in the lumber camps that the loudest men rarely knew the most. He picked up his belongings, 2 axes, a crosscut saw, a battered trunk, a Swedish Bible his mother had pressed into his hands in 1863, and that tool chest, and started walking north away from town toward the foothills where the timber grew thick, and the land hadn't been claimed yet. The first person to tell him he was making a mistake was Vera Coleman, a homesteader who'd survived 3 Montana winters and lost her toes to frostbite in the process. Jacob met him at the general store where he was spending $2.14 of his stake on nails, a dozen candles, and a sack of cornmeal. "What are you planning?" Vera asked, eyeing the meager supplies. "Building a cabin up near Flint Creek." Vera set down the harness strap he'd been examining. He was a careful man, methodical, the kind who measured twice and cut once. "You got timber mill?" "I'll cut it myself." "You got a crew?" "Just me." "Hardware, window glass, proper roofing." "Got nails and a tarp." Vera pulled off his hat, ran a hand through thinning hair. "Listen to me. I built my place with 4 men over 3 months in summer. Used $200 in materials. You're talking about doing it alone in fall. With what did you spend here?" $214. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Vera lowered his voice. "I ain't trying to discourage you, but mathematics don't lie. A man needs 12 in logs, 40 feet of them, hundreds of pieces. Needs to notch every corner perfect or the wind cuts through. Needs a proper roof or the weight of snow will collapse it come February. You know how much snow we get? 68 in last year. 68. That's more than a man is tall sitting on top of whatever you built." Jacob nodded, listening. Vera wasn't wrong about the challenge. He was wrong about the solution. "I appreciate the warning," Jacob said, truly. He paid for his supplies and left before Werner could continue. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted across the valley, and somewhere up in those hills, there was a place where a man could build something that would last. 3 days later, he found it. The spot sat in a natural depression about 4 miles from Deer Lodge, sheltered on 3 sides by granite, outcroppings, and ponderosa pine. A spring bubbled up 40 feet from where he planned to build. Running cold and clear even this late in the season, the ground sloped gently south, and when Jacob paced off, he found a section maybe 20 feet by 18 where the earth was level enough to work with. More importantly, there was a vertical rock face on the north side, weathered granite that rose 12 feet high and extended about 14 feet across. It wasn't much to look at, but it was one wall he wouldn't have to build. He set up his tarp between 2 trees and spent the first night listening to elk bugle in the distance and trying not to think about Vera's words. 68 in of snow, 12 inches logs, $200 in materials. He had $7.18 left and maybe 5 weeks before killing frost. The mathematics looked impossible, which meant the mathematics would have to change. Morning came cold. 28 deg with frost silvering the meadow grass. Jacob built a small fire, boiled coffee in his dented tin pot, and started walking the property, not looking for timber yet, looking for what the land was trying to tell him. The Sioux who'd hunted these valleys for generations didn't build above ground. When they settled for winter, they built into it, created spaces where the earth itself became insulation, where thermal mass worked with them instead of against them. The Norwegians he'd worked with in the lumber camps talked about how their ancestors in the old country had built homes half underground, stacking sod for walls, creating structures that stayed warm with half the wood. Jacob wasn't Norwegian or Sioux, but he wasn't stupid either. If I'm looking for folks who understand traditional frontier building methods and survival wisdom, I'd be grateful if you subscribed. We're documenting techniques that kept people alive when a single mistake meant death. And we're losing these stories faster than you'd think. Hit that subscribe button to help preserve what the frontier settlers knew. He spent that entire day doing something that would have looked like madness to anyone watching. He didn't touch his axes, didn't cut a single tree. Instead, he dug for feet back from that granite wall. He marked out a rectangle with stakes and twine 16 feet wide, 12 feet deep. Then he started excavating, cutting through to feet of topsoil and root mat into the clay layer beneath. The work was brutal. His hands blistered, then bled, then calloused over. He rigged a simple dirt moving system using a canvas tarp and a log as a roller, dragging load after load of excavated earth up and out. By the third day, he'd created a pit roughly 2 feet deep across the entire rectangle. His back screamed. His shoulders felt like they'd been beaten with clubs, but the hole was there, and the pile of displaced dirt was growing beside it. On the fourth day, a rider approached. Thomas Brennan was a former Army scout who'd taken up cattle ranching with his brother. He was 56, weathered as jerky, and had seen enough frontier death that he recognized the signs. He reined in his horse at the edge of Jacob's property and sat there for a full minute, watching this crazy Swede dig a hole in the ground. "What exactly are you doing?" he finally asked. Jacob straightened, wiping mud from his hands. "Building a cabin. That's a hole. It's the beginning of a cabin." Thomas dismounted, walked to the edge of the excavation. "You planning on living underground like a prairie dog?" "Planning on living warm, son. I've built 3 structures in Montana. All of them proper above-ground log cabins with stone chimneys and pitched roofs. I know what works." "How much firewood did you burn last winter?" The question seemed to catch Thomas off guard. "I don't know, for cords, maybe 5. "And how many times did you have to get up in the night to feed the fire?" "That's just how it is. Temperature drops to 20 below. You feed the fire or you freeze." Jacob nodded toward the hole. "The earth for feet down stays at 48 to 52 year-round. Don't matter if it's 20 below, on the surface, or 90 above. Down there, it's constant. Build half your living space below grade. Use the earth as insulation, and you cut your heating needs by 60, maybe 70%. Thomas snorted. "You making that up?" The how to build earth lodges on the Missouri River. Payne do the same in Nebraska. Norwegians have been doing it for centuries in the old country. It ain't new. It's just forgotten. Forgotten because it don't work. Thomas said. "You'll get moisture problems, flooding come spring, walls collapsing. And even if you manage to dig this full hole, you still need timber for the upper portion for the roof. Where's that coming from?" "I'll manage." "With what money?" "Those logs you're going to need, if you could even cut them proper yourself, would cost $40 at the mill." "You got $40? "No, sir." "Then what you got is a hole in a death wish." Thomas shook his head, climbed back on his horse. "I'll check on you in a week if you're still alive. Maybe we can talk sense." He rode off, and Jacob went back to digging. By the end of the first week, the pit was complete. 16 feet by 12 feet, excavated to a depth of 34 in at the back where it met the granite wall, sloping to 26 in at the front. The floor was hard-packed clay, naturally level, and the pile of displaced earth rose 6 feet high to the north. Now came the part that would either prove him brilliant or kill him. Traditional log cabin construction required massive timbers 12 to 14 in diameter, 40 feet of usable length per wall, carefully notched and fitted. The labor was immense. The material cost was prohibitive, and for a man working alone, it was borderline impossible in the time he had left. But Jacob wasn't building a traditional log cabin. He'd noticed something during his first survey of the property. The pine forest wasn't just big trees. There were thousands of smaller specimens for 2-6 in diameter growing so thick they choked each other out. Foresters called them dog hair stands. Trees too close together to thrive. Too thin to mill, essentially worthless for conventional lumber. Worthless for conventional lumber, perfect for what Jacob had in mind. He spent the next 3 days cutting these smaller trees. Not randomly, he selected them carefully, thinning the overcrowded areas, taking trees that were already struggling. Each piece was 8 to 10 feet long, for 2-6 and thick. He stripped the bark, let them dry in the sun, and began stockpiling them next to his excavation. By the 10th day, he had 147 poles stacked and ready. The construction method was old, predating American settlement by centuries. The French called it poteaux or sole posts on cell. The principle was simple. Instead of massive horizontal logs, you set smaller vertical posts close together, creating a palisade-style wall. Fill the gaps with a mixture of clay, grass, and small stones. The result was solid, insulated, and required a fraction of the timber. Yucca began on the north wall, or rather the lack of one. The granite face would serve as the entire back wall. He just needed to seal the gaps between stone and roof. For the east and west walls, he dug a shallow trench set in a sill log as a base and began placing his poles vertically 6 in apart. He secured each one with wooden pegs and the precious nails he bought, creating a framework that rose 5 feet above ground level, which meant it actually rose 7 feet above the excavated floor inside. The front wall was trickier. He needed a door and ideally some way to let light in. He framed an opening 4 feet wide using his straightest poles, reinforcing it with cross pieces. For a door, he lashed poles together horizontally with rawhide strips and deer sinew he'd made from an elk he'd shot on day 6. By the 14th day, the vertical framework was complete. The structure looked insane. A forest of poles sticking up out of a hole in the ground, but the bones were there. On the 15th day, Mary Catherine O'Reilly arrived. She came with her husband, Patrick, a railroad worker turned farmer who'd filed a claim 6 miles east. They heard about the crazy Swede building some kind of underground fort, and Mary Catherine, who'd been a school teacher in Philadelphia before heading west, had opinions about proper construction. Mr. Peterson, she said, surveying the work with frank disapproval. I've read about frontier housing in Harper's Weekly. This doesn't match any recommended design. Jacob was mixing clay, grass, and water in a pit he dug for that purpose. His hands were caked with mud up to the elbows. No, ma'am, I don't expect it does. Proper ventilation requires windows on opposite walls. You have none. I'll cut a vent in the roof. The Homestead Act specifications call for structures of at least 10 by 12 feet with a window and door. You might meet the size requirement, but the lack of proper fenestration could void your claim. Patrick put a hand on his wife's shoulder. Mary, let the man work, but she wasn't done. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm trying to prevent you from wasting what little time you have. Winter here is brutal. We lost 3 neighbors last year. One family froze when their chimney caught fire and they couldn't relight it in time. Another man died of pneumonia in a cabin that looked solid but had gaps in the chinking. He never found the third. She paused. The third simply disappeared. They found him in April when the snow melted. He tried to walk to town for supplies and didn't make it. I understand the stakes, ma'am. Do you? Because this. She gestured at the structure. This looks like a desperate experiment. And desperate experiments in Montana territory usually end with unmarked graves. Jacob set down his mixing paddle. Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, truly, but I've got maybe 3 weeks before serious snow. I can't build what Vera Coleman built. I can't afford what Thomas Brennan built, so I'm building what I can build with what I have using methods that have worked in other places for other people. Maybe it fails, maybe come spring you're standing over my grave, but maybe, just maybe, there's more than one way to survive a winter. Mary Catherine studied him for a long moment. The clay mixture you're making, what's the ratio? 3 parts. Clay, 2 parts grass, 1 part water, adding some horse dung for binding if I can find it. That's actually correct for dog work. She looked at Patrick. He's making waddle and do medieval European technique. I read about it at the academy, Will. It hold, Patrick asked. In England for centuries here. She shrugged. I genuinely don't know. They left. But not before Mary Catherine made Jacob promise to signal them with smoke if he got into trouble. 1 fire means you're fine. 2 fires means you need help. 3 fires means emergency. That night, the temperature dropped to 19. Jacob slept under his tarp and woke to find frost coating everything, including his blankets. 3 weeks until snow, maybe less. He worked like a man possessed. The dog process was tedious but effective. He packed the clay mixture between the poles, smoothing it with his hands, creating a wall that was 6 in thick in places. The combination of wood, clay, and dried grass created remarkable insulation. He worked section by section, letting each portion dry for a day before moving on. By day 19, the walls were complete. The structure was weathertight on 3 sides with the granite providing the 4th. The excavated floor meant the living space was 7 feet high inside. Despite the walls only rising 5 feet above grade, standing inside felt like being in a cave, dark, close, but undeniably warmer than outside. Now came the roof. Traditional roof framing required massive ridge beams and rafters. Jacob had neither the materials nor the time. Instead, he used a technique he'd seen in a Norwegian lumber camp, a reciprocal roof frame. He cut 6 poles, each 12 feet long, and arranged them in a circular pattern where each one supported the next, creating a self-supporting hexagonal structure. The center rose to a peak, allowing for a small vent hole over this frame. He laid smaller branches in a tight weave, then covered everything with the pine boughs he'd been collecting for 2 weeks. Over that went his waterproof tarp secured with rocks. Over that went several inches of sod he'd cut from the displaced earth pile. The final roof was 10 in thick, heavily insulated, and sloped enough to shed water and snow. Total material cost so far, $214 for nails and candles. He'd used every single nail. But he wasn't done. The real innovation, the part that would either prove his genius or confirm his madness, was still to come on day 23. With the first serious snow predicted within days, Jacob began the final phase. The firewood system. Every frontier cabin faced the same problem, keeping fire alive through brutal winters. It required massive amounts of wood, constant attention, and frequent trips outside into life-threatening cold. Men froze gathering fuel. Fires went out in the night, children died. But Jacob had noticed something while digging his pit. Heat doesn't just rise, it moves laterally through materials, and the earth, once warmed, holds the heat for hours. He'd left the front wall of his cabin with an unusual feature. The duwork extended 3 feet forward from the pole framework, creating a thick hollow column of clay and stone on either side of the door. These weren't decorative, they were thermal batteries. Behind the cabin, where the granite wall rose, he'd built something else during his digging phase that everyone thought was wasted effort. A second, smaller pit 4 feet deep and 6 feet across, lined with stones and connected to the cabin through a narrow tunnel he'd cut through the base of the granite. This was the firewood vault. The concept was simple but elegant. Instead of storing firewood inside the cabin where it took up precious space and introduced moisture, or outside where it absorbed rain and snow, Jacob stored it underground in the vault. The tunnel meant he could access it from inside the cabin without ever stepping into a blizzard. More importantly, the vault stayed at that constant 4,852 of ground temperature, cool enough to prevent rot, warm enough to keep the wood absolutely dry. But that wasn't the clever part. The clever part was the heating channel from the cabin's small fire pit just a feet across, built on a raised stone platform. Jacob had dug a narrow trench through the floor under the wall and into the firewood vault. This channel, lined with flat stones, allowed hot air from the cabin fire to flow into the vault before venting through a small chimney he'd built on the far side. The physics worked like this. Fire in cabin creates heat. Heat rises through the channel into the vault. Hot air warms the stored firewood and the surrounding earth, eventually vents out the chimney. The warmed earth radiates heat back through the granite wall into the cabin for hours. The dry firewood means cleaner, hotter burns with less fuel. The whole system becomes a closed loop of stored and radiated heat. Similar principles had been used by Romans 2,000 years ago with their hypic systems, by Koreans with their anal floors, by the Anastasi and their cliff dwellings, heat storage. Thermal mass working with physics instead of against it. On day 26, Jacob lit his first fire in the completed cabin outside. The temperature was 22nd degree chair with a bitter wind. Inside the partially buried structure with its earth-insulated walls and thermal mass system, the temperature climbed to 60 for Degar and stayed there for 6 hours after the fire burned down to coals. He'd used 1/8 the firewood burner Coleman would burn in the same time frame. The system worked. On day 29, the first real snow arrived, 6 and fell overnight, blanketing the valley in white. Jacob woke warm, stepped outside to check his chimney, and found Thomas Brennan sitting on a horse in his front yard. "I'll be damned," Thomas said. "Morning. I came to recover your body." Thomas dismounted, walked around the structure from outside. It barely looked like a building. The roof covered in snow blended into the hillside. Only the door frame and chimney indicated human presence. "This is the craziest thing I've seen. How warm is it in there? Come see." Thomas ducked through the door and stopped. The interior was dim but comfortable. The fire pit held glowing coals. The temperature was noticeably warmer than outside. Thomas guessed around 60. But what caught his attention was the firewood. "Where's your wood pile? Don't need one inside." "Then where?" Thomas noticed the tunnel. "What's that?" Jacob showed him. Crawled through to the vault where 4 cords of firewood sat stacked and bone dry. Despite the snow above, showed him how the heated air from the cabin fire cycled through, warming the storage area and the granite wall. Explained the thermal battery concept, the constant ground temperature, the reduction in fuel needs. Thomas listened without interrupting when Jacob finished. The old scout stood there for a full minute. "How much did you spend building this?" $7.18 total, $214 on nails and such, $5 on the tarp. Candles were in that first purchase. $7, yes, sir. And you did all the labor yourself? Yes, sir. In 29 days? Yes, sir. Thomas walked outside, circled the structure again, came back in. "I spent $240 building my place. Used for men and 3 months. And I'm burning 4 times the wood you will this winter. Guaranteed." He shook his head. "I don't like admitting I'm wrong, but I'm wrong. This is smart, real smart. It's old techniques," Jacob said. "Nothing new, new to Montana, new to me." Thomas paused. "You planning to file a claim on this land?" "Was thinking about it. Do it today because when word gets out, and it will get out, every broke settler in the territory is going to want to see how you did this." He was right. By December, 17 people had visited the cabin. Jacob showed every single one the construction method, the material costs, the firewood system. Didn't charge a penny, just shared what he'd learned. Vera Coleman came on December 8th. Stood in the toasty cabin with snow falling outside and started laughing. "I told you it was impossible. You told me traditional methods were impossible." Jacob corrected. "You were right about that. I was an idiot. I'm building one of these next spring. Going to modify my current place. You mind if I bring some folks by to see it?" "Bring whoever you want." Mary Catherine O'Reilly came 3 times. Once to see it completed, once to measure and document the construction process, and once with a reporter from the Helena newspaper, who wrote a piece titled "Underground Shelter Defies Winter Logic." The article mentioned the $718 cost, the 29-day timeline, and the radical departure from conventional wisdom. That winter was hard. Temperatures in Deer Lodge Valley dropped to 31 Freeride in January. 63 in of snow fell between November and March. 2 homesteaders died of exposure. 5 cabins suffered roof collapses. Firewood shortages killed livestock across the region. Jacob used 2.5 cords of wood for the entire winter. His firewood vault never froze, never got wet, and provided enough dry fuel that he rarely let the fire burn for more than 2 hours at a stretch. The thermal mass system stored enough heat in the earth and granite that the cabin stayed above 50, even when outside temperatures hit their lowest points. He spent those winter months reading his mother's Swedish Bible, carving kitchen utensils from pine, and thinking about the strange path that had led him here. Losing his job had seemed like a disaster. Getting evicted had felt like rock bottom. But sometimes the worst things open doors to something different, something you'd never have found if life had gone according to plan. In April, when the snow melted and the valley turned green, Jacob filed his formal homestead claim. The land office clerk looked at the description, partially subterranean dwelling with integrated thermal storage system, and asked if he was joking. "No, sir, it's real and it works." By spring of 1877, 14 similar structures had been built in Montana Territory. Settlers modified Jacob's design in fascinating ways. One Norwegian family added a second underground room for cold storage, creating a natural refrigeration system. A German builder incorporated a bake oven into the thermal mass wall, using retained heat for bread-making hours after the fire went out. A widow named Elizabeth Thorne built one by herself in 42 days for less than $10, proving it wasn't just men who could manage it. The design spread through the Western Territories like wildfire. Not because they were perfect, they had limitations. Moisture could be an issue if drainage wasn't managed correctly. The initial labor was brutal, and they required skills in earthwork that not every settler possessed. But for broke homesteaders with more time than money, more determination than resources, the math was undeniable. $7 versus 200, one man versus 4, one winter of survival versus a gamble on conventional wisdom. Today, most of these structures are gone. They return to the earth they came from, leaving barely a trace. But if you know where to look in Montana, you can still find depressions in certain hillsides. Still spot the granite outcroppings that once formed back walls. Archaeologists have documented 43 confirmed sites using variations of Jacob's design. The National Park Service has reconstructed one at the Grand Course Ranch National Historic Site, showing visitors how frontier innovation often came from necessity, not luxury. The principles Jacob rediscovered, the desperate autumn remains. Sound, modern passive house design uses the same concept of earth coupling and thermal mass storage. Ground source heat pumps move warmth between buildings and the constant temperature of deep earth. The most energy-efficient homes in Scandinavia incorporate earth berming and underground spaces that echo the dugouts and earth lodges of the American frontier. Jacob Peterson lived in his cabin for 3 years before building a larger home on the same property. He married in 1879, raised 2 daughters who both survived to adulthood, a remarkable achievement in frontier Montana. He died in 1914 at age 80, having seen automobiles, electric lights, and the closing of the frontier he'd once inhabited. But he never regretted that cabin. His granddaughter wrote about it in her memoir. Published in 1952, grandfather kept that first cabin maintained his whole life. Every few years he'd replace the roof thatch, shore up the walls, check the firewood vault. People asked why he bothered since we had a proper house by then. He'd say, "That cabin taught me something. The best solution isn't always the biggest or most expensive. Sometimes it's the one that works with what you have, where you are, with the time you've got in a territory that killed people for making mistakes. Being right about that kind of thing meant everything." The mathematics of Jacob's cabin are worth considering. $7.18. 29 days, one-man temperatures at 60 while the valley froze at 30 below. For in 1/2 months on 2½ cords of wood, compare that to Vera Coleman's conventional approach, $240, 90 days, for men. Similar interior warmth, but at 4 times the fuel cost, and constant fire management. Alcove's solution saved about 93% on materials, 67% on construction time, 75% on fuel, and eliminated 75% of the labor force. He didn't do it with new technology. He did it by asking a different question. Not how do I build what everyone else builds, but what does this specific situation require, and what resources does this specific landscape provide? That kind of thinking built the frontier, not blind adherence to how things had always been done, but adaptation, not spending money you didn't have on solutions that didn't fit, but using what you had in ways others hadn't considered. It's a way of thinking that's scarce now. We've got lumber yards and hardware stores, heating systems and insulation panels. We've got building codes and conventional wisdom that, to be fair, prevents a lot of dangerous experimentation, but we've also lost something, that willingness to look at a problem and say, the standard solution doesn't fit. What else could work? Jacob had $9 and change, 5 weeks, and a Montana winter coming. He had a background in lumber, some awareness of how other cultures solved similar problems, and the humility to learn from the land itself. What he built wasn't pretty, it wasn't conventional, but it kept him alive, cost almost nothing, and worked so well that people copied it for years. Sometimes the best innovations come from the people who can't afford to fail, who don't have the luxury of buying their way out of problems, who have to think harder, work smarter, and trust that nature's already solved most of the problems we think we invented. If you believe that kind of frontier wisdom still matters, that there's value in documenting how people survive impossible situations with nothing but intelligence and grit, I hope you'll subscribe. We're preserving stories that demonstrate what's possible when conventional solutions don't work, and you have to think your way to survival. These aren't just history lessons. They're proof that human ingenuity, when backed into a corner, can accomplish remarkable things with almost nothing. Jacob Peterson's cabin is gone now. The spring that bubbled up beside it still flows cold and clear, 40 feet from where that granite wall rises into the Montana sky. The depression where he dug his pit has filled in, grown over with pine saplings and wild grasses. You'd never know a man once survived a brutal winter there. Warm and dry on $7 and the willingness to think differently, but the principle remains. The mathematics remain. And somewhere maybe someone else will face an impossible deadline with impossible resources. And remember that once in Montana territory, a man threw out before winter built something that worked better than anything conventional wisdom said he should. That's what matters, not the specific cabin, not the exact technique, but the proven fact that when you've got nothing left but time running out and winter coming, thinking different isn't just an option. Sometimes it's the only option that works.